keyboard riff for Jump. He had played it for Dave and Ted, and he said Dave and I at least hadn't liked it as much the first time we heard it, and I still wasn't sold on it now, meaning he had played it for them before, he played it for them again, and he said they kept looking at each other and just cringing every time they heard the keyboards. He said it sounded like something you'd hear playing in between innings at a baseball stadium. And he said it sounded very pop, and Van Halen wasn't a pop group. Jump was way too pop for my ears. He said, I wanted them to stay edgy and raw. Diver Down served its purposes, but it was too pop for me. I liked the Fair Warning stuff better. I thought these guys should stay right in that pocket. And then he was saying how Ed was encouraged by Don Landy to follow his muse. But he said the song grew on Ted, and Ted had Dave write lyrics. And he said that Dave wrote the lyrics to Jump in an hour. He said initially he was concerned that it sounded like someone was trying to commit suicide. It was too rough and a heartless perspective. But Dave started to give him the perspective on it. He said that Dave was a genius when it came to songwriting, and he said that if Dave hadn't come up with those words, Jump, the song would have never had the same impact, for sure. And he said, now I knew, well, I thought I knew it was a hit, but I thought, oh my God, Van Halen is over, sonically at least, because the abandonment of Van Halen had just disappeared into Pop City for me. As a fan, I wanted them to stay true to their core character as a band. He started talking about how Hot for Teacher and Panama were, that was Van Halen. He loves those songs. He loves Top Jimmy. He loved Drop Dead Legs. To him, that goes, that's Van Halen. He talked about Dave and the unique perspective that he had. And he says Dave looked around at life like everything around him like it was a huge cartoon. His words and his unique way of seeing the world were a big part of why the band was special. He also went on to continue to praise Mike. He says about Mike, the guy never missed a beat. His bass playing was always superb. He did everything right, including singing backgrounds with an unbelievable voice. You couldn't ask for a better bass player to go with Ed's guitar playing. I mean, if that isn't praise, right? I mean, Dave, he went out of the way, and he was talking about Dave's lyrical contributions were an essential but underappreciated part of what made Van Halen so great. So he really lays it on the line there for Mike and Dave, right?
Yeah, it gets full props.
Yeah.
To those guys. You know, it's not just the Ed Show anymore, like he was saying in 78. So he's come full circle and given Dave the props where he so deserved them. And still giving credit to Michael Anthony, deservedly so.
Right. And then he started saying that Ed and Don were not taking the deadline seriously for 1984, and it was causing tension, and it was becoming like a camp between Dave and Ted and Ed and Don, and it was getting a little bit uncomfortable. But he says that Dave was never the bad guy with all the drama surrounding these sessions. He said he always did his homework. And he said if this had happened at Sunset Sound, this would have never happened on his watch. Then he got into the song I'll Wait, which he was not a fan of. And he used to break Ed's balls about it when he would play the keyboards for I'll Wait. Ted would kind of razz Ed by singing Argent's Hold Your Head Up. And it would drive Ed crazy. It would get him upset. And he says, I just didn't love Ed's new keyboard stuff. In part because I thought it diluted what made Van Halen distinctive. Then he just talked about how Dave asked for help from Michael McDonald on the chorus and the melody, and apparently Michael McDonald did a lot of work on that song, more than we thought. He worked on the song title and the lyrics and the chorus melody, and they were really trying to beat the clock here with the production on this album in 1984. Apparently, when he hears the album, he says it still bothers. He says, I'm still not crazy about Jump. He says, but Ed was on the money. So he gave Ed credit. I mean, it's a number one song. It's an anthem for the 80s. But he said, I would have never have guessed that would happen, meaning like that it would be so big. He said, that thing wouldn't have come out if I had been part of the process. And then it also talks about I'll Wait and how Michael McDonald wasn't originally credited as a songwriter on that song. And it impacted Ted's close relationship with Michael McDonald. What did you think of this whole 1984 situation? This was wild, and he got into the whole story that we know you mentioned before. about the hiding of the tapes. With you get into it, Dave, and you can talk more on this, how Ted needed the masters and Don was hiding them, and he was...
That was just like insane.
That was unbelievable.
To read that, like the stress levels were so high.
Yeah.
Like I was alluding to before, Ted would show up. It's like, oh, Don's not here. And then, he's driving away and he's, effectively like holding the tapes hostage. And what was he threatening to do with them? Like throw them somewhere. I forget exactly what he was going to do with them. But Ted was really at the end of his rope at that time.
Right.
I mean, and yeah, sure, because if they were at Sunset Studios or Amigo Studios or wherever, like this would not be an issue because the tapes would be there,
right, and
they'd be done. And the fact that Ted has his home studio now, and now they're like playing these games and shenanigans, it's tainting the water and it's tainting the relationship. And by the way, I think Don Landy does the same thing again.
Yeah.
Later on with the 5150 album.
I know.
And as a reader, and Ted doesn't talk about that because he wasn't part of that, but that was elsewhere. But for me as a fan, like whenever I read this stuff, I'm like how many times is Don going to pull this stuff?
Yeah, it is really
because like after a while, the record company is going to be like, you know what? If this is how it's going to be every album, we're
I know.
Like we're not going to deal with you. Which is why with 5150, the record company insisted that there be an outside producer,
right. Which was
because
Jones,
like after the whole 1984 thing,
right?
I mean, if Eddie Van Halen comes to you and says, yeah, it's just going to be the band, which is really me and Don, and we're doing the album,
right?
And you're the executives at Warner Brothers, and you're sitting there going, okay, so Ted's not going to be a part of it.
Right.
What do you think about that?
Yeah.
No.
Right.
No.
Right.
Because we remember what happened last time.
Absolutely.
So,
and you know what?
We're not doing that. And the whole thing with Michael McDonald not being credited as a songwriter.
How is that possible?
Exactly. Like, I feel like somebody purposely did that.
I know.
Which is amazing because there was a whole written contract for this.
I know.
I mean, this stuff was up for auction, for crying out loud.
I know.
I mean, there's proof that this happened. And the fact he didn't get credit, first of all, it's illegal. It's a slap in the face. The guy does you a favor.
Oh, huge favor.
And what happens? I don't think it was an oversight. I mean, that's like, come on. And I don't know who in the organization.
Yeah.
But somebody was just like, no, we don't want that to happen.
Right.
We don't use outside songwriters, so there'll be none of that. Honestly, I don't know who it is. I don't know if it was somebody in the band. I don't know, if it was somebody in the back office. I mean, who the heck knows?
Right.
But because believe me, if I were Michael McDonald, I'd be ticked off too. It was a big hit, right?
Yeah.
He did them a favor.
Exactly, but let's look at this now. Ted is the producer for the Doobie Brothers. He's also the producer for Van Halen. He's also the record executive for the Doobie Brothers. He's also the record executive for Van Halen. He's also good friends with Michael McDonald, who also is a huge star. So how do something like that with all of those levels get flown through the cracks? I don't understand that.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It doesn't make any sense.
And insulting. And the thing is, it was such a big hit, even though Ted thought it wasn't going to be a big hit. But by Ted's own admission elsewhere in the book, picking singles was not always his strongest suit.
Right.
And he totally gives Ed full props
for
pushing on that song, and they did it as a single.
Yep.
And now it's just one of those 80 songs.
Right.
And he fully admits that Ed was right. Ed was totally right with that.
He said Ed was on the money. Yep, he said
Yep.
Now, this is another part of the book where it gets a little murky, and it's very curious. This is where this is like stepping on the very thin ice here. We're talking about the Crazy from the Heat era. So now let's look at the facts, and I sort of have a detective's theory on this thing, and I have a whole new perspective on this breakdown of Van Halen after reading this book. You talk about Crazy from the Heat, which started in the early summer of 1984. Apparently, Crazy from the Heat was Ted's idea. He basically said he was going to do something to avoid anything that sounded like hard rock. It was going to be the antithesis of Van Halen. It was going to be tongue-in-cheek fun. He says, I figured this would help Dave get his stuff out of his system and give him a clean slate to start the next Van Halen record. He said that his motivation was to wake Ed up. I mean, it says right there in the book. He says, my motivation was to wake Ed up, meaning like he was going to shine the light on Dave and then, maybe it would like agitate. Now, let's be honest. Ted was already agitated about how 1984 was made and how they missed the deadline. Originally, 1984 was going to be released at the end of 1983, so I guess around like December, like a Christmas release, and it ended up coming out after the first of the year, and they missed the deadline on that, and he blames Don and Ed for that because they kept changing the mixes and still doing work on it. And Ted was definitely, hands down, aggravated about Van Halen and what happened with 1984, even though it was a monstrously successful album, and he probably got incredibly rich off of it, all that stuff, but he doesn't really talk about money much on there. He said that he wanted Ed to take a hard look at himself and find the strength to straighten up. Almost like that Crazy from the Heat was going to buy some time for Van Halen to straighten out. He says, I believe that Dave didn't have any interest in leaving the band when we worked on Crazy from the Heat. He says, if I had gotten even the slightest sense that he saw this as a step one of David Lee Roth's post-Van Halen solo career, I wouldn't have done the record. I never, ever wanted to do anything to threaten the future of Van Halen. I can't emphasize that enough. Now, he says those words, which I believe that he believes. But at the same time, he says over here that he wanted to wake Ed up by, doing a solo EP with Dave. Now, we all know how Dave's ego is gargantuan. So you're going to give Dave a solo spotlight? You're going to give budgets for these big MTV videos and make these big singles, and you're going to promote this, and this is not going to cause a problem in the band. I don't care if the songs weren't hard rock. It doesn't really matter. In the 80s, everything was everything. You have to remember, in the 80s, things were different. Like, whether you had a hard rock song or a pop song, it was, like, all part of, like, the mainstream radio. It's not like it is today where everything's segregated. Well, no, that's heavy metal. Well, no, that's speed metal. Well, no, that's thrash metal. Like, everything is so broken down now. Back then, Huey Lewis was on the charts with Van Halen, who was on the charts, with Cyndi Lauper, who was on the charts, with Bruce Springsteen, who was on the charts, with Tina Turner. I mean, back then, everything was all one big mixed tape. You don't see that as much now. You look at the charts now, you don't see rock songs. It's all the pop stuff that competes with the pop stuff, and the rock stuff is separate. You know what I mean? He says, I thought the Crazy from the Heat EP was a good move, and that it would keep Dave creative, Van Halen in the public eye, and give Ed time to get it together. And he says Dave prepared and worked hard. But then he says, I was very surprised at the splash it made. Dave had made himself even bigger than Jump had made him. And then he started to getting into the movie idea. Now, of course, with Dave having such success with the solo EP and especially the videos that accompanied Just a Gigolo as well as California Girls, he got the movie Crazy from the Heat greenlit.
When I read the book, I did get a takeaway that it was Ted's idea to do it. I think he was very supportive of it because he thought it would bring the band together, which kind of surprised me because anytime somebody starts doing a solo album, you got to wonder why they're doing a solo album.
Right.
It just breeds all sorts of questions. And apparently, as we learned from Noel's book, like the band didn't even know it was being done at the time.
Right.
So that was probably another slap in the face. The thing that Ted underestimated was how well the EP did.
Right.
I mean, it had 2 huge hits on it.
Yep.
Like you said, made Dave's ego even bigger.
Oh, huge.
And so that was the beginning of the end. And then Dave said, hey, let's do a movie. And, Ted's not a video guy, right? Like, he didn't understand why they were doing the video for Pretty Woman. And so when Dave's like, I want to make a movie, Ted was like, I'm paraphrasing here, but Ted was basically like, I don't understand why you're spending so much time on this movie. It's,
right.
You're the singer in a band.
Yeah.
You should be working on the next album,
right.
Not the movie.
So then he says here, this is where it gets wild. Ted says, I didn't see it coming, but looking back, it's clear now that particularly for Al, the EP was one of the deal breakers when it came to putting up with Dave. Because the EP so angered those guys in retrospect, I wish I had avoided doing it. I wasn't hell-bent on producing the next Van Halen record. My attitude was that 1984 had taken a lot out of all of us, and if